The castle stood silent and foreboding on the hill, a relic of an age long past. Its cracked walls and shattered windows were barely visible through the downpour that raged outside. Inside, lightning flickered through the halls, momentarily casting eerie light on the cluttered remains of an old laboratory. In the heart of this dilapidated place, a man labored feverishly. His hands trembled as he made final adjustments to the web of wires that crisscrossed the room, leading to a single figure lying on a metal table. A body, a grotesque patchwork of flesh and bone. The scientist's face was drawn with exhaustion and anticipation. This was the moment he had waited for, the culmination of his life's work. He had fought against the laws of nature, against life and death itself, to create something extraordinary, something no one else had dared to try. He pulled the lever, a deafening crack of thunder sounded outside, and a bolt of lightning struck the castle's tower, sending a surge of electricity through the wires. The machine roared to life, filling the air with the smell of burning metal and ozone. The body on the table twitched, convulsing violently as a current ran through it. The scientist held his breath, eyes locked onto the creature's face, waiting for the impossible. Then slowly the creature's eyes opened. For a brief moment triumph surged in the scientist's chest. He had done it. He had brought life from death. But the moment was cut short as the machines began to overload, sparks flying from the cables, and the air hummed with uncontrollable energy. The scientist rushed towards the switch, but it was too late. A final surge of electricity ripped through the room, striking the scientist down where he stood. His body crumpled to the floor, still and lifeless, as the storm raged on outside. The creature slowly sat up, its movements stiff and uncertain. It glanced around the room, its gaze eventually falling on the scientist's motionless body. There was no understanding in its expression, only convulsion and a hollow emptiness. It stumbled off the table, its legs unsteady beneath it, and wandered toward the door. With no sense of where it was or what had happened, the creature stepped into the night, leaving the lifeless body of its creator behind. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the village below the castle quiet and damp. The streets were still empty, save for the few villagers cleaning up after the night's chaos. Alara watched them from her bedroom window, her fingers absently tracing patterns in the condensation on the glass. She had heard the commotion last night, people screaming, doors slamming, and the frantic murmur of fear that had spread through the town. But now all that remained was a sense of uneasy calm. Her father had warned her to stay inside. The village was buzzing with rumors of a monster, a creature seen in the dead of night towering over the people, its body stitched together like some kind of unnatural horror. Alara wasn't so sure what to believe. The village was prone to superstition, especially when it came to the old castle on the hill. It had been abandoned for as long as she could remember, a place of whispered legends and dark stories. But something about the rumors unsettled her. There was a strangeness to them, a hint of truth she couldn't ignore. What if the creature wasn't just a story? Later that morning, when the village had settled into its routine, Alara slipped out of the house, unnoticed. She walked quickly through the narrow streets, heading toward the woods that bordered the castle grounds. The air was cool and damp, the scent of wet earth and pine heavy in the air. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that something had drawn her here. It didn't take long to find him. Alara froze at the sight of the creature, sitting by the stream, hunched over, as though trying to make himself smaller. His back was to her, but she could see the crude stitching on his skin, the pale patches where different pieces of flesh had been sewn together. He was massive, his limbs thick and heavy, yet there was something about the way he sat that made him seem vulnerable. She took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. A twig snapped beneath her foot, and the creature's head snapped around, his eyes locking onto hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. His eyes were wide, filled with something that wasn't anger or aggression. It was fear. Alara took another step closer. Alara returned to the stream every day. At first, she wasn't sure what had compelled her to keep going back, but as the days passed, she realized that she couldn't stay away. There was something in the creature's eyes that tugged at her, something that made her want to understand him. He was always there, sitting in the same spot by the water, waiting in silence. Each time she approached, he watched her with a weary expression, as though expecting her to flee like the others. But she never did. They fell into a strange routine. Alara would sit a few feet away from him, talking softly about her life, her thoughts, her questions. She told him about the village, about the people's fears and superstitions. She spoke of her father, who was strict and overprotective, always keeping her close, never letting her venture far from home. The creature, though silent, listened, He never spoke, but his eyes followed her words, his expressions shifting ever so slightly in response. Over time, Alaire learned to read those expressions. A furrowed brow meant he was confused or curious. A slight tilt of the head meant he was trying to understand, and sometimes, just sometimes, there was a faint softening in his eyes, as though he was amused. She started bringing him food, small pieces of bread, fruit, whatever she could carry without raising suspicion. At first, he hesitated to take it, but after a while, he began to accept her offerings. He ate slowly, almost cautiously, as though he wasn't quite sure how to handle the kindness. Alaire began to feel something for him, something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear or pity, but a deep sense of connection. She realized that, despite his appearance, he wasn't a monster at all. He was just alone, lost. One day she decided to give him a name. "I'm going to call you Ash," she said, watching him closely for any reaction. "It suits you." The creature blinked, his head tilting slightly, and for the first time, Alaire saw something close to understanding in his eyes. He accepted the name, and with it, something else passed between them. A bond, fragile, but real. As the days turned into weeks, Alaire's absence did not go unnoticed. Her father grew suspicious. He began to watch her more closely, asking where she had been, why she seemed so distant. Alaire tried to avoid the questions, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he discovered the truth. One evening, her father followed her into the winding woods, his footsteps quiet as he trailed her through the trees. When he saw her sitting by the stream with the creature, his heart froze. The thing that everyone in the village feared, the monster they had spoken of in haunted tones, was sitting beside his daughter, and she was talking to it, as though it was human. Rage boiled inside him. Without thinking, he stormed forward, grabbing Alaire by the arm and pulling her away from the creature. "What are you doing?" he shouted, his face twisted with anger. "Have you lost your mind?" Alaire tried to pull free, but her father's grip was iron. "He's not dangerous," she cried, her voice desperate. "He's not what you think." "Not dangerous?" Her father's voice was filled with fury. "Look at him. He's a monster, Alaire. Do you think I'd let you?" He turned toward the creature, his eyes blazing. "Stay away from my daughter." The creature stood slowly, his massive form towering over them, but his expression was not one of anger, it was one of sadness. He understood that the man feared him, and no amount of words or gestures could change that. Alaire's father dragged her back toward the village, ignoring her pleas. He locked her in her room, determined to keep her safe. But as he left the house, Alaire knew what he was planning. He would gather the villagers, and he would hunt Ash down. She had to stop him. Inside the cold, crumbling walls of the castle, Ash roamed the familiar halls. The place with its long-forgotten secrets was the only home he had ever known. But tonight, the castle felt different. It was no longer just a place of refuge. It had become a prison of his creator's making, haunted by memories he couldn't fully grasp. Ash returned to the room where he was born, the old laboratory now a decaying ruin. The machines, broken and rusted, were all that remained of the scientist's ambition. As he stared at the cold, lifeless table where he had first opened his eyes, something deep inside him stirred. A flash of memory surged, fragmented images of the man who had brought him to life. He remembered the scientist's face, worn with exhaustion and madness, and the moment his creator gave Ash's life. Ash's hand rested on the table, and he felt a strange, heavy pull, as if the weight of his creation was settling over him. He wandered further into the laboratory, and that was when he noticed something he had never seen before. Tucked beneath a pile of debris was a journal. The cover was charred, the pages worn and delicate, but still intact. Ash hesitated before opening it. He could barely comprehend written language, but the journal felt important, like it held the key to the questions that had plagued him since the moment he awoke. Flipping through the pages, Ash's eyes caught on sketches, detailed drawings of himself, annotated with scribbled notes. The scientist's ramblings were chaotic, but there was one phrase that stood out, written over and over again. The key to eternal life lies in the soul. The soul must be bound. Ash didn't understand, but a deep unease settled over him. Was this why he was made? To trap a soul inside his body? He traced the lines of the drawing, realizing with a sickening dread that he wasn't just created from parts. He was created to fulfill a purpose he hadn't chosen. A soul was bound to him, but whose soul? His own? His creator's? Suddenly the pieces began to fall into place. His existence, the fragments of memory, and the scientist's death, they were connected. And now, as he stood alone in the darkened lab, Ash understood one thing clearly. He wasn't just a monster. He was something more. Alaire's feet pounded against the forest floor. the trees blurring around her as she ran toward the castle. She had escaped through the window, a crack that had been left there beforehand. The sky had darkened, and the distant sound of the village mob grew closer with every passing second. She pushed herself harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she darted through the hidden path that Ash had shown her. There was no time to waste. Her father and the villagers would show no mercy when they reached the castle. She had to get Ash before they arrived. As she slipped through the secret entrance, her thoughts raced. How had everything spiraled out of control so quickly? Her father had always been a stern man, but his hatred for Ash was beyond reason. He had convinced the entire village that Ash was a threat, that he had to be destroyed. But they didn't know him like she did. They couldn't see the humanity in his eyes, the sadness that rooted itself deep within him. Alaire found Ash in the lavatory, staring down at an old journal clutched in his large hands. His expression was distant, troubled. "Ash," she whispered, stepping toward him. "We have to leave. They're coming." Ash's eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a moment he hesitated, his mind clearly preoccupied with something important. Alaire followed his gaze to the weathered pages. "What is that?" she asked. He gestured to the journal, flipping it open to show her the scribbled notes and sketches. Alaire scanned the words, trying to make sense of them, her brow furrowed. "The soul must be bound," she read out loud. "What does that mean?" Ash shook his head, unable to explain, but the weight of the revelation hung heavy between them. Whatever the journal revealed about his creation, it was far more complicated than either of them had thought. Ash wasn't just a patchwork of bodies stitched together. It was a result of an experiment in something much darker. Alaire's hand tightened around his. "We'll figure this out later. But right now, we have to go." She led him out of the lavatory, moving quickly through the castle's hidden corridors. But as they approached the exit, the glow of torchlight flickered in the distance. The villagers were close. Too close. The mob arrived at the castle gates, their torches lighting up the night. Alaire's father stood at the front, his face twisted with anger and determination. "We know you're in there," he shouted, his voice echoing through the castle hollow walls. "Come out, monster, and face your end." Ash froze as the shouts grew louder. His instinct screamed at him to run, but Alaire's hand on his arm kept him grounded. "We can still escape," she whispered, though doubt began to creep into her voice. The villagers were relentless, and her father would stop at nothing. As they made their way through the hidden tunnels, the sound of footsteps and shouting filled the air. The villagers had breached the outer walls and were spreading through the castle. Alaire and Ash moved as quickly as they could, but the castle was a maze, and soon the mob would be upon them. They emerged into the courtyard just as Alaire's father appeared on the opposite side, flanked by several villagers. His eyes locked onto them, and in that moment the fury in his gaze was enough to freeze Alaire in her tracks. "Get away from that thing, Alaire," he bellowed, advancing on them with a torch in hand. Alaire stood firm, positioning herself between her father and Ash. "He's not a monster," she cried, her voice breaking. "He's not what you think." But her father's rage was beyond reason. "He's a creature of darkness," he spat. "You're blinded by whatever spell he's cast on you." Alaire's heart raced as the villagers grew closer, their weapons raised. She had to do something, anything, to stop this madness. She turned to Ash, her voice soft but urgent. "Ash, show them that you're not what they say they are. You need to see." Ash hesitated, his expression conflicted. He had always stayed hidden, afraid of what would happen if they saw him. But now, with Alaire's life at stake, he knew he couldn't run anymore. Slowly he stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. The villagers recoiled, their fear evident, but Alaire's father wasn't moved. With a shout, he lunged forward, swinging his torch toward Ash. In a defiant and desperate act of love, Alaire placed herself between her father and Ash, blocking her father's path and silently pleading for understanding. Her father's anger, however, burned as hot as the torch he held, and in a moment of blind rage, he lashed out, accidentally striking her with it. Alaire crumbled to the ground unconscious as the gravity of his actions sank in. Her father, shaken and horrified, slammered an apology, realizing too late the damage he'd done. But for Ash, the sight of Alaire hurt by the one who should have had protected her was too much. Determined to honor her wish for a life free from fear and pain, he lifted her gently and turned his back to the village. Together they set off into the unknown, away from the people who could never understand their bond. The cabin nestled in the mountains was peaceful, a world apart from the chaos they had left behind. Alaire and Ash spent their days in quiet harmony, building a life together that was simple and free from the fear that had once bounded them. The villagers had let them go, but Alaire knew that her father's heart had remained hardened, too full of fear to ever accept what she had come to know, that Ash was no monster. Weeks passed, and the journal Ash had found in the castle still sat on a small table in the corner of the cabin, its pages filled with the dark scribblings of the scientists, haunted Ash, but Alaire refused to let it control their lives. Every time Ash picked it up, she gently took it from his hands, closing it before he could delve too deeply into its secrets. "It doesn't matter," she said one night, as they sat together by the fire. "Whatever is in that book, whatever happened before, it's over. We're free now. We don't need to understand everything. We just need to live." Ash looked at her, his brow furrowed with uncertainty. He couldn't shake the feeling that the journal held something vital, something about his existence that he couldn't ignore, but Alaire's voice was soothing, her touch soft, as she placed her hand over his. "Let it go," she whispered. "We have each other. That's all that matters." Ash hesitated, his eyes flicking to the journal one last time, but in the warmth of her gaze, the weight of his questions seemed to lift. He set the journal aside, pulling her close, and together they watched the firelight dance across the walls. In that moment, the past no longer mattered.